Hello, how's everybody doing? Welcome. And for our repeated listeners, welcome back. I am Sharon Roberson Pinder, President and CEO of the Capital Region Minority Supply Development Council. The Council also operates the U.S. Department of Commerce First Virginia MBDA Center. Welcome to our HotChat podcast, Minority Business Connections. We're season 2, episode 2. You all know I love saying that because I think I have a Netflix series featuring today my good friend Arnold Sowa. Today we're speaking to Arnold, who currently serves as one of our advisors on the board of directors for the Capital Region Minority Supply Development Council, CRMSDC. He most recently was a senior vice president and chief procurement officer for MetLife. As we continue our work, it is our mission to feature one-on-one conversations with MBEs, CEOs, supply diversity, and procurement professionals from some of the leading companies across this region. In these Hot Chat podcasts, one of a kind, we will spotlight the successes, the challenges, resources, and opportunities that exist for our vast network of MBEs and our corporate members. We will also continue to showcase our corporate partners who share in our vision and our mission to help drive equity and economic development across this country, especially during these most challenging times. So stay tuned and feel free to share your thoughts on topics that we may cover in the future because we are here because of you. Visit our website, and by the way, it's brand new, www.crmsdccares.com, but also stop by our new website, which is crmsdc.org. Before I bring on our distinguished guest, allow me to take time to recognize our corporate sponsors who help us do what we do every day. As they say, they help us keep the lights on. And so we have Exelon, our title sponsor, which is made up for us for BGE, an Exelon company, and also Pepco, an Exelon company. Southwest Airlines, the Hilton, AMCAS, one of our premier MBE sponsors, Capital One, CompuGain, JDC Events, another one of our MBEs, SB and Company, number 6 in the country in terms of auditing federal dollars. I just know one of those many tidbits about them, and one of our premier MBEs, and Stroud Priest, one of our MBEs as well. Let me bring on our guest, but before I do, just want to tell you a little bit about him. Arnold Sowa is an independent advisor, consultant, and speaker. He most recently was a senior vice president and chief procurement officer for MetLife, as I shared. In that role, he was responsible for overseeing MetLife's global procurement programs, travel, third-party risk management, and supply chain social responsibility program. That's a whole lot. We're going to talk about that. He also recently served on the board of directors and was treasurer of the National Minority Supply Development Council, NMSDC, and currently serves on the board of directors of the Capital Region Minority Supply Development Council. He's won numerous awards for his support of supply diversity initiatives, including NMSDC's CPO of the Year in 2018 and ISM Supplier Diversity Advocate in 2016. As Chief Procurement Officer at MetLife, Arnold built a global organization of over 300 professionals in almost 50 countries who managed over $5 billion in annual spend. He also was responsible for putting in place global third-party risk management and travel policies and programs, and led the largest ever global implementation of Ariba On Demand, which now covers over 95% of MetLife spend. His prior procurement experiences have been at Bridgewater Associates LP, the largest hedge fund in the world, where he was responsible for building a new procurement organization as an advisor of GMAC Alley Financial on creating their third-party risk management program, and as CPO of Capital One. Well, Arnold, your resume is enough to choke a horse, but we wanted to dissect that a little bit. How are you doing today?
I'm doing okay, Sharon. Thank you. Thanks for having me here. And
No, we thank you because part of what we try to do with these podcasts, Arnold, is to kind of get into the DNA and to the head of folks like you. And so, because you bring a wealth of knowledge, and it helps whether you're a supply diversity person in one of our corporations, or if you are an MBE, to just understand the kind of like the psyche of kind of what goes on. And so, in order for us to do that, we kind of dig in the background as well. Now,
Okay.
we don't do a background check on you, but what we will do
Thank goodness for that.
is have a kind of conversation. And you have such a wonderful kind of background. And the thing with saying, and people often hear me say, one of my favorite sayings is, if you want to know what's at the end of the road, it's a Chinese saying, ask someone coming back. And in retirement, you're that person we can meet in the middle of that road to ask. And so let's start with, how did you, let's start, where are you originally from?
Originally from Joliet, Illinois.
Okay, so a Midwesterner.
Midwest.
And how long have you lived in the capital region area?
Gosh, I moved out here to join the World Bank back in the early 90s. So it's been a while.
Okay. So that's that's wonderful. And so you came out here to join the World Bank. What were you doing before then?
Before the bank, I was actually in graduate school out in California.
Mhm.
And did a couple of master's degrees out there. And prior to that, I lived in Africa. I worked for the UN and the Peace Corps. I was in Africa for 6 years.
Where in Africa?
So I served in the Peace Corps in Malawi and Botswana,
Okay.
and then joined the United Nations in Botswana, and then they transferred me to Mozambique.
Okay. What was that experience like for you? And why did you choose the Peace Corps is the number one, question.
Yeah, so that's I don't know how much time you want to spend on this, but
I believe it's the basis of the foundation of who you are.
yeah, so I like to say everything I learned about being successful in business, I learned in the Peace Corps.
Okay.
And
See, I knew I was coming somewhere with this. Okay.
yeah, and it's and just to make a long story short is when I first got there, well, first off, how I ended in the Peace Corps, I studied chemical engineering with a minor in civil engineering in college. I went to Northwestern in the Midwest. And I did a short co-op in a chemical plant, and nothing against chemical plants and chemical engineers, but I looked at what I would have been doing if I had joined there in a full-time job and said, there's got to be more to life than making polypropylene and polyethylene pellets. So, and I wanted to make a difference in the world.
Okay.
And I felt, I could take my engineering skills to Africa, and they were looking for water and sanitation engineers, and I signed up, and that's how I ended up over there.
Okay. So I'm imagining that experience in Africa took you completely out of comfort zone. It took you into an arena by which you hadn't experienced. Is that correct? Am I correct in making that assumption?
Yeah, no, I think my life, a large part of my time there, especially in the Peace Corps, I was living in a mud hut with no running water or electricity. So yeah, I would say I was a little uncomfortable at times. Yeah.
Yeah. Was that your expectation when you went there?
Yes.
Okay.
I fully expected that. Yeah.
Okay.
Now, it was ironic because I actually worked in the district commissioner's office and had to go to work in a suit and tie, but where I lived and where I worked were two different things.
That is so very, very interesting. And so how do you then attribute that experience to who you are? Because you're a very giving person. But I would assume that you were a giving person, and that was kind of like who you are before you got there. But how did that aid you in terms of your future decisions?
Well, I knew, I always felt it important to give back. So, and that led me to after I left the UN, I decided to go to grad school. I did a short stint in a consulting firm, but my real goal was to go back to development work. In grad school, I did a master's in developmental economics and an MBA, and went for a few years to work at McKinsey and Company. And the thinking there was, it was a postgraduate MBA program in a way to really learn how to solve problems using their frameworks and so forth. And then from there, I went to the World Bank. And the idea was to go back to the places I had lived, treating and many times the symptoms of problems, and actually work on the root causes of problems, which really was economic development of the the private sector. So,
As you look back over, and I'll move forward in just a moment, of your time and that experience, what was your most what gave you the most joy in terms of accomplishments?
most joy was actually just seeing things. Well, let me take a step back. I would say the most joy came from seeing, understanding, and then taking ownership of the change that we were trying to make in the countries I was working in. Because all too often, and I'll use the World Bank as an example, all too often the bank will come in, and I don't mean this as a criticism of the bank, but it's just how they operated was with a lot of money. And a lot of times you would have governments paying lip service to the changes we were asking for just to get the money. And I didn't like to work that way. And I really spent a lot of time working to try to develop understanding and ownership of the changes we were trying to make. And then when I saw, or when I would see, actually my partners in the government who we were working with actually advocating more strongly than me for some of the changes we were trying to make, I said, yeah, I really did my job. So.
Excellent. Outstanding. I think I shared with you before, I spent some time in Liberia after the war, and my key takeaway was one of the things you get to do in that particular case at that particular time was help rebuild the nation.
Yeah.
And so I certainly can appreciate, because I remember the no running water pieces myself. So when you come away with a great appreciation of life and some of the privileges that you do have as Americans.
Well, let me put it this way. I never complained. A lot of my colleagues, I ran at MetLife and Cap when I had the travel program, and I frequently get these complaints from people about the hotels we would make them stay in. And I'd say, well, let's see. Does it have running water? Does it have electricity? And are there bed bugs? And if it's yes, yes, and no, then what are you complaining about?
Right. You have the essentials.
Yes, that's right.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit more about what was kind of like the pinnacle of your career?
So I don't think there's any one thing. I really enjoy building things. I enjoy building teams and working with teams and developing people on those teams. So I would say in all the roles I've had, whether it be my time at the World Bank or at Cap One or even Bridgewater or MetLife, I think it's seeing the fruits of the team's efforts, trying to build something and make it better. So.
Okay, tell me, how did you then get into the tell the audience a little bit about your entree as a Chief Procurement Officer.
Yeah, so I actually thought I was going to spend my whole career at the World Bank, but then kids happened, and
how many kids do you have?
I have three.
Oh, okay, wonderful.
Yeah.
And how long have you been married?
Oh gosh, 27 years. Yeah.
I have to be careful about asking that question. I should make sure I know the answer to the question first, right? Because I don't want somebody to tell me, well, I'm not married. But anyway.
Yeah, I have kids, which is okay. That's okay too. So, no, so long story short was, I was really enjoying my work at the World Bank. Thought I would never leave, and but my wife works. She's an attorney in the federal government, and we had a child already and a second one on the way. And my last couple of years at the World Bank, I was working in East Asia, and I was in Hanoi and Laos, every other month. And my wife just said, "This can't continue." So I said, "Okay, I'm going to leave so I can be home for my family." And lo and behold, I ended up at Capital One because it's literally down the street from where I live at their headquarters in McLean.
Okay.
And I joined a strategy group, as they often do with ex-consultants. They put us in a strategy group. And the first problem I was given to work on and to solve was, and I got to remember, this is the early 2000s when when Capital One still thought of itself as a marketing company, not a bank. Mm-hmm. But the banking regulators had different ideas because it was getting fairly big in the credit card space. and they had some issues around how we did not manage our outsourced operations. So I was asked to build a third-party risk management program as my first project. And I said, well, I know nothing about that. And they said, figure it out and build it. And so I did. But it required reengineering procurement because the processes, the due diligence and so forth requires a fairly strong procurement process to meet the federal banking requirements. So I did that. And they said, well, you're the only one here who knows this stuff now, so why don't you run it? And so I created the role of Chief Procurement Officer.
Okay.
And that led me into, just by chance, into supplier diversity. And I worked with a gentleman on my team named Ruben Sanchez. Some of you may know Ruben from his days in supplier diversity, but he didn't start out there. He started out in managing labor for me at Cap One in the team that we had there. And we started looking at our spend and we said, gosh, there's almost nothing being spent with minority or other diverse suppliers. And we looked at each other and said, this doesn't really line up with both our customer base, which was large minority component at the time, and also initiatives within the company to build out a diverse employee base. And I will say Cap One is always trying to do the right thing, and I brought this issue up to senior management and said, look, I think this is the third leg of the stool that's missing. You got these other two, but we need a diverse supply base. And they fully supported me as Ruben and I built out the program. And I'll be honest, I didn't know anything about supplier diversity at the time. I remember speaking with your predecessor at the Virginia Minority Supplier Development Council, Tracy Peter. And Tracy and the Virginia Council were instrumental in helping educate me on how to build out a supplier diversity program. One thing I'm really, really proud of is we went from nothing to within 18 months to winning the award for the best corporation of the year. So I'm very proud of that.
That is truly remarkable. And so certainly what you can't measure. And so the fact that you were able to do that. And one of the things that people don't realize, or people may not know, is that the Supply Diversity Council, NMSDC, CRMSDC, part of what we also do is support corporations in their supply diversity program. But what you said was very, very key. It sounded like you had top-down support. How important is that in the execution of this type of program, any program in the organization? What has been your experience?
So I think you can, so the quick answer is it's critical. I think you can go a good distance without it, but to really be truly effective, you need to have senior management support, because ultimately, you will run into some roadblocks with certain lines of business where you need help breaking through those roadblocks. And I always found having senior level support was critical in doing that. So
roadblocks, with any of those roadblocks did you encounter come from just the negative thoughts?
No, it's interesting. The role of the CPO is you're in the middle, right? And you're dealing with suppliers on one hand who are knocking down your door at times, trying to get in. But on the internal side, you have internal business clients who, many of whom have their favorite suppliers, or they're in a hurry. They don't want to go through a procurement process. I'm just a bump in the road, they would say. You're a roadblock to me doing what I need to do, and to bring in a new untested supplier. In many cases, that's what we're asking them to do as we introduce new suppliers, diverse suppliers. It can take some doing, arm twisting on the inside. So and as the CPO and the procurement organization, you're stuck in the middle trying to find the right balance between the two.
Okay. But you also had a notion around, because when you look, so supply diversity within a corporation is just a part of, it's a seed. But when you look at just what happens across the nation, right? And so you look at behavior, you look at just outside influences. Did you find at all at any point in time that would be a challenge in terms of changing people's mindsets along just any point in your career?
Yeah. So, I mean, do you mean in terms of the resistance I would face in the companies, or? Yeah.
What part did racism ever play a part?
So I wouldn't. Yeah, I don't know if it was overt racism,
Mhm.
but I would. This you could get a sense that people would say, well, look, I want a really well qualified supplier, and I'm not sure that this one that you're trying to introduce can do the job.
Yeah.
And you could, maybe it's racism, maybe it's just that it's a smaller, untested supplier, or maybe it's a combination of both. But what I often found was, so one thing I was always clear about, and the way we set up our program, both at Cap One and then as we did in MetLife, was we never lowered the bar. And I always made that clear, and I always led with it. We are not lowering the bar. We are looking for excellent suppliers, whether they're owned by Black, Hispanic, whites, women. It doesn't matter. That's it. We're looking for excellent suppliers. Now, I saw it as my job to cast that net wider as we search for those suppliers. And Ruben and I came up with something called the Rule of One at Cap One, and we introduced it at MetLife as well, where how do you cast that net wider? We said for every RFP that goes out, we should have at least one diverse supplier in that RFP, at least one, if not more. And then I used to get internal resistance from my sourcing team, because then that's extra work for them. They have to go find the suppliers, but it's interesting how you can motivate people by tying their bonuses to how well they follow the rules. So,
accountability at its best.
Well, money. It's the money. So I put in place a bonus structure. The large part of the bonus was, did you have 100% adherence to the Rule of One? Now, we always, there's always exceptions, and there were certain categories of spend where they said, gosh, I can't find, a well-qualified minority-owned or diverse supplier in that category. We don't want to waste anyone's time. We don't want to throw a supplier in there who's not qualified just to meet, an arbitrary rule. And so what they had to do was go to the supplier diversity head and plead their case, and they could get a, get out of jail card from that person and say, you tried your best, we've tried our best, we can't find one, it's okay to proceed without that. But otherwise, you had to have a diverse supplier. So by casting that net, and once they were in the RFP, there was no favoritism, a colorblind process. It's based on who is the best supplier. And no surprise, I mean, those of us that have worked with minority-owned businesses, many of them proved their mettle and actually came out ahead and won many of those bids, and so it was a win-win, right? So we ended up with better service, better pricing, better value for the company, and to the credit of the internal business, once they saw that, they were on board. But it's getting them over that initial hump that was always hard.
It was changing the behavior, and what I always found is that changing the paradigm of people thinking of it as a social program versus a business imperative. And so what I wanted people to hear, and thank you for sharing that, and you need to write a book, Arnold, is that you were able to, it's no small feat to go someplace and change the behavior. And you were able to set that up within the organization, which is part of your legacy. I'm sure it's still part of what makes an organization successful today. And so I think that's just an awesome thing. And thank you for being there because you didn't have to do that. And so you stuck your neck out in order to kind of make that happen. Talk a little bit more about some of the things that maybe like Tier 2 program or mentorship programs that you also implemented.
Yeah, so when we set out to build the program, the easy part was, I won't say easy, it wasn't easy, as I described, but the most fundamental thing you can do is increase the spend with minority-owned and other diverse suppliers. And the first thing we did was put in place metrics to measure it, and then report out on those metrics, and I would report out by line of business. And I think shedding some light always does a lot of, it helps drive the right behavior. But you can't change what you can't measure. So that was the first thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I talked a little bit about the rule of one and how we actually brought in more diverse suppliers. But one of the things that we found is that many of these suppliers were too small, didn't have the right level of experience to compete at the right level for business at a firm as big as MetLife or Capital One, right? So, what we then set out to do is that how do we find the diamonds in the rough? How do we find those firms that we think could grow into being a supplier that we could work with? And I really do think, and I was a strong believer that it was our responsibility to try to do that. And so there's a couple different ways we did that. One was the Tier 2 program, which I think I don't need to explain to your listeners what that is. And we actively would partner our Tier 1 or our prime suppliers with smaller minority-owned businesses. And they would come in as subs, and through that process, they would actually learn how to work with a firm as big as the ones I was at. And how did we do that? How do we provide the right incentives for the Tier 1 suppliers to do this? Well, we put out clear RFP language to say, look, that will be weighted in your RFP proposal, that the more you sub out to diverse suppliers, the more points you get, right? So by them having a program to bring in diverse suppliers that work as a Tier 2 to us, they actually have a better chance of winning the bid. And then we would put in language, and very important once you do that, is have language in the contract to enforce that with penalties if they don't meet those commitments. So that's something that we did to develop that program. The other thing we did, and I started this at Cap One, where if you know anything about the history of Cap One, it was founded by two management consultants. They hired a lot of ex-management consultants like myself from BCG and Bain and McKinsey and other places. I said, gosh, we got all these really smart management consultants, strategy consultants working here in various roles throughout the company. And I have all these minority-owned businesses who could use some business advice. And so we developed a mentorship program to match them up. And I actually myself even mentored a African-American women-owned marketing firm in DC. And just because I wanted to be part of that. And so we found this was another way to help the minority-owned businesses develop, what they needed to actually compete. And we continued a similar program like that when I was at MetLife. So those are some of the things we did for the Tier 2 program.
Okay. And then it sounds like what you also advise is don't do it alone in terms of leveraging the social, you leveraged your social responsibility office?
Yeah, so there was me in procurement and we had supplier diversity, but I said, we had limited budget, as is always the case in corporate America, right? So, and I wanted to be out there more. I wanted to sponsor events. I wanted to get our name out there, but I had a limited budget. So I would go to and if you go to, a lot of companies have foundations, they have social responsibility offices, they have a diversity and inclusion office. So I would go to them and explaining, this is better than what you're doing. This is not handouts. This is actually actively developing businesses, that will give back to the communities not as a charity, but through actually giving them business. So I would actually get them to sponsor some of the events on behalf of the corporation. I also would leverage our internal communications and marketing departments to help with our own internal change management efforts. The other thing that was key, as I mentioned, when I worked with Tracy, is just the external outreach as well. Being a member of something like the CRMSDC and the NMSDC and WeBank, and I learned so much from my peers at other corporations, but also from the MBEs, through these events, just listening to them, one of the things that really struck me as I listened to MBEs talk about how difficult it was to do business with, big companies like ours, it forced me to take a look, reflect internally and say, could we make this less complex? Could we make it easier to navigate? Big complaints I used to hear is your terms and conditions, insurance requirements and indemnification clauses in the contracts were just impossible for a smaller business to meet. So we actually took a hard look at those things and went back and changed many of those things to make it easier for minority-owned businesses to do business with us.
Is there anything, and this is all very, very valuable, but I've learned so much about you and your experience today. I'm sure that many of our certified minority-owned firms listening are eager to hear your thoughts on how do you navigate? Because one of the key things we always talk about access to capital. What minority firms don't have are those relationships. But any tidbits or nuggets that you might want to share about how to navigate through those larger organizations, which can be very daunting.
Yeah, I think it can be very. I've certainly heard it from enough MBEs how intimidating it can be and how it's very business. Just the difficulty and the maze that you have to go through. So just a couple thoughts from the perch I used to have. So first thing I would say is put yourself in the shoes of a chief procurement officer or a sourcing lead at these large corporations. And as I mentioned earlier, there's so many competing priorities. The internal business wants one thing. The finance department wants savings. Every year I had a goal I had to hit, and every year it got bigger. So I'm always looking for that. And then on the other hand, the suppliers, and I would get literally hundreds of cold calls and emails and pitches. And those are the ones that got through the corporate filters. I mean, there's even more that we were able to stop. So just totally overwhelming. And the one thing I would say is, I can't tell you how many suppliers have approached me and said, "We can do whatever you want. What do you need? We can do whatever." And
they were hungry.
They were hungry, and I could sense that. But I said that doesn't help me, right? I said so the thing that I would say is target your pitch. Take the time to understand the business you're going after, their pain points, their needs. Because the more you can come in and say, "Look, I know you guys are working on this product," and we can talk a little bit about how you find that out. But I may have something that may be of interest to you for this. Do you think I could get 5 minutes of your time for that? And that generally, it's like if it's something I know someone wants, and then I can actually, we can match that up quickly. I think it helps. The other thing I would say is, understand the requirements for the sectors you're targeting, and I'll speak to financial services, but I think the same thing applies to whether it's food services or construction or the media industry or so forth. Financial services is a highly regulated industry. The federal banking regulations dictate how we use third parties, and the third parties have to meet certain standards. I found myself frequently asking the CPOs at other large banks, who do you use? Because I know if they're using them, I can use them, because that means they've been through the ringer on the due diligence required. So understand those requirements and ask yourself, can I actually meet those? And educate yourself. It's really easy if you Google federal banking requirements for third-party risk. You can pull up the OCC bulletins. It'll tell you exactly what you're going to need, because that's what the banks are following. Again, probably very similar for other industries. Some other tidbits, at the companies I was at, we had a portal for supplier diversity. Register there. Make sure you're certified. That goes without saying, because we tapped into the databases of the MSDC and WeBank, for instance. Attend networking events with people from these companies. Ask questions. To my earlier point, try to understand versus just pitching. Try to understand what they're doing and where they may have something that you can do. Something else, and try to differentiate yourself. I'm stating the obvious here, but
sure.
I'll give you an example. There's so many IT staffing firms, and if you're in this space, which I'm sure a lot of your listeners are, and there's nothing wrong with that. But because there's so many, how do you make yourself different? Do you have products that you can offer? Do you have consulting services? What do you do different than all the other firms? And so, you really got to think hard about how you differentiate yourself from everyone else in a similar space as you.
Okay.
And then I'll finish up one last thing, and this is something I think I know it applied for where I was at, and I think it applies for many companies, is get to know the supplier diversity professionals at the company. They are key. They're your window into the company, and at least in the programs I ran, they were your, I'm speaking to the MBEs here, they were your inside sales team. They were in there advocating for you. For instance, in our case, the rule of one, they were actively looking for opportunities through this, the RFPs. They knew they would always get advance notice of the RFPs coming up. They could see what was coming down the pipeline 6 months, 12 months down the road. And they were thinking ahead and saying, okay, which diverse suppliers can I be putting in there? And so they are your inside sales team at these large corporations. So those are some things off the top of my head that I can think of.
That's those nuggets. I mean, they're golden. They're absolutely golden. Just one last thought before we wrap. Yesterday, the president signed the infrastructure bill. What we're looking at coming down the pike is I probably won't see it again in my lifetime. And there is so I believe, there's the opportunity. I believe those things that you talked about today is certainly transferable as we look at these unidentified or identified opportunities coming down the pipe for that. We're looking at minority business programs differently as we move in the future. There's conversations about 2.0. When we look at organizations like NMSDC and CRMSDC celebrating 50 years next year, we know that we have to do this a little bit different because the world, I used to hear this when I worked at GE back in the 90s. They would always talk about the global economy and how we compete on the global nature. But we look at just the number of minority businesses across the country, the growth of minorities across the country. I know that this hits home for you. And so I'd like to thank you for what you do, because you wouldn't have done all those things you've done over the course of your career if you did not sincerely care. And for folks to have people who truly care in those places is something that we certainly appreciate. So what's in your crystal ball? What can you tell us as you see us moving into the future?
Oh boy. There's so many different ways I could answer that. And, one, I would say, speaking to what's at hand here is the organization you lead, that you're part of, the national organization. I think these organizations have an even bigger role to play. I think there's some work we have to do, though. I think, when I look at this from the corporate perspective, it's too much, too many factions, too much infighting. I think we need to band. When I say we, collectively, the NMSDC and WeBank and the other organizations need to work together to coordinate things better. A simple example: as a corporation, I have to go to multiple events across in times of COVID, it's a little different, but prior, it would be nice if it was a one-stop shop. But I do think these organizations have a key role to play, because what I see is that corporations want to do more business with minority-owned businesses and diverse suppliers, but they are having the trouble finding, as I talk to, the things that we did to try to develop them, but finding enough qualified suppliers to meet their needs. And this is where organizations like, NMSDC and WeBank and so forth is so key to bringing those together and identifying those opportunities and working with the corporations to ensure there's a good match.
So what world would you like your kids to operate in the future?
So I didn't mention this earlier, but my wife is a person of color, so which I guess by extension my kids are, and I want them to be in a place where they feel they have every opportunity that everyone else has or had. I'm a white guy, obviously, and I feel I grew up very privileged because of that. And I can't even begin to imagine some of the difficulties people of color go through in this country, and I don't ever want them to have to go through that. So that's the kind of world I want for them, but also everyone, right? So
It's truth to power, ladies and gentlemen. We heard it here from Arnold Sowa. Thank you, Arnold, for all that you do for the council and all that you have done in your during your journey that many people have benefited from. And so I appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. I've learned a lot and very, very thankful. So thank you.
okay, you're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Okay. All right. We've wrapped up now another one of our, that was what episode? What did I tell you all? Season 2, episode 2. That was really, really special. Now, before we go, I'd like to take the time to recognize our corporate sponsors and thanks to each of them for all what they do to support our mission. And so for those who are just listening and can't see, I'll just run off real quickly. AARP, Allianz, AT&T, BAE Systems, BWI, Thurgood Marshall, Ellison, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, FRS, Horseshoe, Ideal, Leidos, Lockheed Martin, M&T Bank, McCormick, Metropolitan Washington Airport Authority, Northrop Grumman, Peapod, PNC Bank, Salesforce, Sodexo, Truist, United States Postal Service, Washington Gas, Zillion Technologies, and Zones. So last week, we announced our historic milestone, the launch of the Virginia MBDA Center. We encourage you to visit our website, which is www.mbda-virginia.com to learn more about it and to take advantage of the resources this center will provide as well as the council. Coming on Friday, December the 3rd, is our annual business meeting. Be there, be square. I always want to say that out loud. But during this meeting, you'll hear the highlights of the year and what's ahead for 2022. And lastly, please stay connected as we're planning more of these great discussions with our MBEs and corporate members. Thank you to our coronavirus and relief team and Grable Media for all of your hard work behind the scenes to help us deliver this content. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube at CRMSDC is our handle. And you can listen to these podcasts on Spotify, Google, and Apple. See you next time. Thanks.